The winter of 1939 hit the Nebraska plains like a fist. When temperatures dropped to 20 below zero, homesteader Carl Hansen watched ice form on the inside walls of his cabin and felt the wind cut straight through the mud chinking he had packed between every log, just like the homesteading manuals told him to do. He had built his shack exactly the way every settler on the Great Plains was supposed to build it. Tight log walls, clay and straw filling the gaps, proven and trusted. By February, he had burned through 4 cords of wood and still woke to frost on his blankets. Across the territory, dozens of homesteaders were losing the same battle against the cold in cabins built by the book and failing by the season. That spring, Carl quietly started pasting layers of old newspapers to his interior walls using nothing but flour and water. Neighbors laughed at his paper shack, calling it a fire trap and a fool's waste of time. But when the blizzard of 42 buried the plains for 3 straight weeks, Carl's cabin stayed 20 degrees warmer than his neighbors while burning 40% less wood. What did Carl understand about trapping dead air that every builder today should know? Carl Hansen had learned to build the way every man on the Nebraska frontier learned to build. The technique came straight from the homesteading manuals sold at Murphy's General Store in town. The same instructions printed in the Farmer's Almanac and passed down through camp conversations around evening fires. Take your logs, notch them tight, pack the gaps with whatever clay and straw you could scrape together from the prairie, and seal it solid. The method made perfect sense to men with empty pockets and short seasons. Clay cost nothing but digging time. Straw lay scattered after every harvest, and any fool could mix mud and stuff it between logs. The technique carried the weight of generations. Scandinavian grandfathers had chinked log walls back in the old country using clay and moss. German settlers along the Missouri River swore by clay mixed with chopped grass. Even the railroad crews Carl had worked with during his younger years before the war built their temporary shelters the same way, packing gaps with whatever earth and fiber they could find. It was time-tested, material-tested, and approved by every authority that mattered to homesteading families scraping by on quarter sections of raw prairie. But time-tested did not mean winter-tested. Not on the open plains where wind carried teeth, and January nights dropped to depths that froze spit before it hit the ground. The winter that followed Carl's cabin raising taught him the difference between what worked in theory and what worked when the mercury disappeared below the glass bulb entirely. His neighbor Olson, 3 homesteads east, lost 2 pigs and 3 chickens in his barn during a cold snap in December when temperatures plunged to 30 below zero for 6 straight days. The clay, chinking in the barn walls, had cracked under the repeated freeze and thaw cycles of early winter, opening gaps wide enough for deadly drafts to pour through. Olson found his animals huddled in the corner farthest from the worst cracks, frozen solid despite the thick timber walls and carefully applied mud ceiling. The Jensen family, newcomers from Iowa with a cabin built according to every specification in their homesteading guidebook, burned through their entire winter wood supply by the middle of February. Mrs. Jensen told Carl's wife that ice formed on the interior walls every night, thick enough to scrape with a knife come morning. Their children slept in layers of wool coats and still woke shivering, their breath visible inside what should have been the warmest room in their world. Jensen himself spent his days splitting and hauling wood that disappeared into his stove like water into sand, never quite warming the space beyond the immediate reach of the flames. Carl measured his own cabin's failures in different terms. He had built it exactly to specification, using techniques learned during his years working railroad construction before the Great War. Every log sat level, every notch cut precise, every gap packed with clay mixed to the proper consistency with prairie grass chopped fine, yet cold seeped through in ways that defied logic. The corners stayed perpetually chilled, no matter how long he kept the fire burning. Frost crept up the interior walls, despite his efforts to seal every visible crack. His monthly wood consumption ran nearly double what the guidebooks promised, and still the cabin felt more like controlled outdoor space than genuine shelter. The problem ate at him through the long nights when wind rattled the windows and found its way inside despite every precaution. Carl's father had been born in Norway. Raised in timber country, where men built to survive winters that lasted 7 months and temperatures that killed exposed flesh in minutes. The old man's stories spoke of walls built thick, of interior spaces lined with cloth and bark, and anything else that could trap still air against the cold. Dead air, his father had called it, air that could not move and therefore could not carry heat away from where you needed it most. Carl began collecting newspapers that autumn, gathering discarded copies from town visits and asking neighbors for their old editions of the Omaha World Herald and regional farming circulars. The paper felt thin and useless in his hands, nothing like the solid materials his father had described, but the principle remained sound. Trapped air could not steal heat. Multiple layers created multiple barriers. If cloth and bark could work in Norwegian timber country, perhaps paper could work on the Nebraska plains. When he mentioned his experiment to other homesteaders that fall, the response came swift and dismissive. Paper would burn at the first spark from his stove. Paper would rot with the first. Spring moisture. Paper belonged in outhouses, not interior walls. Hansen at the supply store shook his head when Carl asked about flour suitable for paste making, warning that newspaper attracted mice and provided nothing but kindling for house fires. The criticism followed him home in the form of jokes about paper houses and warnings about fire hazards that would endanger not just his own family, but neighboring homesteads as well. Yet Carl had measured the gaps in conventional wisdom with his own shivering skin and calculated woodpile. Something fundamental was missing from the accepted method, some principle that distinguished survival from mere endurance in conditions that tested every assumption about frontier building. Carl began his experiment on the north wall, the side that bore the brunt of winter winds sweeping down from Canada, with nothing to stop them but 300 miles of open prairie. He mixed flour with just enough water to create a paste, thick enough to hold but thin enough to spread evenly, adding a pinch of salt to discourage insects. The consistency mattered more than he had expected. Too thin, and the paste would not grip the logs properly or hold the paper layers in position. Too thick, and it would create lumps that prevented proper adhesion between sheets. Working by lamplight after evening chores, he began layering pages of the Omaha World Herald against the interior log surface. Each sheet overlapped the previous one by roughly 2 inches, creating an interlocked pattern that left no gaps for air movement. The paste soaked into the newsprint just enough to create a bond without dissolving the paper entirely. By the end of the first week, he had applied 7 complete layers across the entire north wall, each sheet pressed smooth to eliminate air bubbles that could create weak spots in the barrier. The technique required more precision than Carl had anticipated. Paper torn during application left gaps that undermined the entire system. Paste applied too heavily created wrinkles and pockets that trapped moisture rather than air. After ruining several sections and starting over, he learned to work in strips roughly 3 feet wide, applying paste to the wall surface first, then pressing each newspaper sheet into place while the adhesive remained workable. The overlapping pattern created a continuous surface that felt solid under pressure, nothing like the fragile material it had been before assembly. Door and window frames presented particular challenges. These joints represented the most persistent sources of infiltration, where conventional chinking regularly failed under the stress of repeated expansion and contraction. Carl cut newspaper strips to fit the irregular spaces around frame edges, building up multiple layers in areas where gaps ran deepest. Around the door frame, he applied 12 layers, each strip carefully fitted and pressed into place to create a flexible seal that could accommodate the daily movement of the door without tearing. The window frames required different treatment entirely. Here the paper needed to seal against both wood and glass, materials that expanded at different rates during temperature changes. Carl discovered that applying the paste directly to glass created problems when moisture condensed and loosened the bond. Instead, he overlapped the paper edges onto the glass surface without paste, relying on the weight of multiple layers to maintain contact while allowing slight movement during thermal cycling. Behind the stove area, where heat created the greatest temperature differential, Carl built the thickest barrier. 15 layers of newspaper created a buffer zone that absorbed radiant heat during firing and gradually released it back into the room as the stove cooled. This area required the strongest paste mixture, reinforced with shredded cloth strips, to prevent sagging under the repeated heating cycles. The newspaper closest to the stove showed slight browning after several weeks of use, but never approached the charring temperatures that critics had predicted. The first major test came during a cold snap in late January, when temperatures dropped to 28 below zero and stayed there for 5 consecutive nights. Carl measured interior wall temperatures using a metal thermometer pressed against the papered surfaces and compared the readings to similar measurements taken at the Jensen cabin, which relied entirely on conventional mud chinking. Where Jensen's interior walls registered 34 degrees Fahrenheit during the coldest nights, Carl's papered north wall measured 57 degrees under identical exterior conditions. The difference translated directly into fuel consumption. During those 5 brutal nights, Carl burned 1 3/4 cords of split oak to maintain interior comfort, while Jensen, in a cabin of nearly identical size and construction, consumed 2 1/2 cords and still struggled to keep his family warm enough for safe sleep. The 23-degree differential at the wall surface meant that Carl's living space retained heat that would otherwise have conducted directly through the log structure into the outside air. More significantly, the paper barrier eliminated the microdrafts that had plagued conventional chinking throughout the winter. Before the newspaper application, Carl could feel air movement near the walls, even with no obvious gaps visible. The paper created a continuous surface that stopped infiltration at the molecular level, preventing the convective heat loss that made conventionally chinked cabins feel cold regardless of fire size or burning duration. 3 weeks into February, Eric Johansson, an older homesteader whose family had arrived from Sweden 15 years earlier, stopped by to examine Carl's work. Johansson recognized the technique immediately, though he had never seen it applied with newspaper. His father had used similar methods in the Old Country, layering birch bark and cloth scraps behind interior planking in their timber farmhouse. The principle remained identical despite the different materials. Create multiple barriers that trap still air while preventing infiltration that steals heat through convection. Johansson confirmed what Carl had suspected about the mechanism. Dead air possessed extremely low thermal conductivity compared to moving air. A single layer of paper provided minimal insulation value, but 15 layers created 15 separate chambers of trapped air, each contributing to the barrier's effectiveness. The overlapping pattern prevented thermal bridging that could short-circuit the insulation system, while the paste ensured that each layer remained in proper position throughout the heating and cooling cycles of daily use. By month's end, Carl had documented a 40% reduction in wood consumption compared to the same period the previous winter. Interior wall surfaces remained consistently above 50 degrees, even during the coldest exterior temperatures, creating a living environment that required less fuel while providing greater comfort than conventional methods could achieve with any amount of wood burning. Even with the newspaper barrier performing beyond expectations, Carl discovered that efficient walls solved only part of the heating equation. During a prolonged storm in early March that kept temperatures below zero for 8 consecutive days, he noticed that heat disappeared rapidly whenever he allowed the fire to die down overnight. The cabin's interior volume, roughly 12 feet by 16 feet with 8-foot ceilings, created a vast pocket of air that demanded constant fuel input to maintain warmth. Each morning, he woke to interior temperatures that had dropped 20 degrees from evening levels, despite the insulated walls that had solved his infiltration problems. The issue became clear during his daily fuel calculations. Even with reduced heat loss through the walls, the sheer volume of air inside the cabin required enormous energy input to raise and maintain temperature. Carl measured the space and calculated that he was attempting to heat over 1,500 cubic feet of air every time he rekindled the morning fire. Standard homesteading practice placed the stove near an exterior wall for chimney convenience, but this positioning meant that most generated heat rose directly to the ceiling and dispersed throughout the entire cabin volume before inhabitants could benefit from it. Carl began redesigning the interior layout around heat efficiency rather than conventional room arrangements. He moved his cast iron stove from its position against the north wall to the center of the main living area, building a temporary partition from salvaged lumber that created a smaller core space roughly 8 feet square. This central hearth area contained his sleeping space, cooking area, and seating, effectively reducing the volume he needed to heat from 1,500 cubic feet to approximately 500 cubic feet. The partition itself became part of the thermal system. Carl applied the newspaper layering technique to both sides of the interior wall, creating an insulated barrier that contained heat within the core area while preventing it from dissipating into the larger cabin space. During evening hours, when the family gathered for warmth, the stove heated only the essential living volume. The outer areas of the cabin remained unheated but served as storage and workspace that required no fuel input. Thermal mass presented the next challenge. Carl's father had described Norwegian farmhouses built around massive stone hearths that absorbed heat during active burning periods and radiated warmth for hours after the fire died. The American frontier offered different materials but similar principles. Carl collected fieldstone from nearby creek beds, hauling roughly 2 tons of granite and sandstone in his wagon over several weeks. He built a platform of fitted stones directly beneath and around the stove base, extending the thermal mass in a horseshoe shape that captured radiant heat from all sides of the firebox. The stone platform measured 4 feet by 6 feet and stood 8 inches high, providing substantial mass to absorb heat energy during peak burning periods. Carl discovered that the thermal capacity of stone far exceeded anything he had anticipated. During active firing, the stones absorbed heat that would otherwise have been lost to convection currents rising toward the ceiling. After banking the fire for the night, the stone platform continued radiating stored heat into the core living space for 6 to 8 hours, maintaining interior temperatures that allowed comfortable sleep without continuous fuel consumption. Water containers provided additional thermal mass with different characteristics than stone. Carl positioned 3 large iron kettles filled with water around the stove platform, each holding roughly 4 gallons. Water's high specific heat meant that these containers absorbed tremendous amounts of energy during heating and released it gradually as the ambient temperature dropped. Unlike stone, which radiated heat primarily through direct contact and infrared radiation, the water containers created convection currents that circulated warm air throughout the core space, even when the stove remained cold. Floor insulation demanded different techniques entirely. Carl had built his cabin with the standard frontier approach of packed earth floor covered with rough planking, but this construction created a massive heat sink that drew warmth directly from the living space into the ground below. Prairie soil remained at approximately 45 degrees Fahrenheit even during the coldest surface conditions, creating a temperature differential that pulled heat downward through conduction. Carl removed sections of the existing floor planking and built up the foundation with a layer of fieldstone, creating an air gap between the earth and the living surface. Over the stone foundation, he laid salvaged lumber to create a raised floor system with approximately 4 inches of dead air space trapped beneath the walking surface. Into this cavity, he stuffed dried prairie grass and corn husks, materials that trapped additional air while providing an insulation barrier against ground conduction. The raised floor system required careful attention to air sealing around the edges where the new flooring met the existing walls. Carl used the newspaper technique to seal these joints, preventing cold air from infiltrating the cavity and undermining the insulation value. Small ventilation gaps at opposite corners of the cavity allowed for air circulation that prevented moisture accumulation while maintaining the thermal barrier. Eric Johansson visited again in late March to examine the modified interior layout. His Swedish heritage included familiarity with central hearth designs common in Scandinavian rural architecture, where efficient heating meant survival during months of sub-zero temperatures. Johansson confirmed that Carl's instinctive redesign matched principles his grandfather had used in timber construction back in Västerbotten province, where winter lasted from October through April and fuel conservation determined family survival. The combined modifications proved their effectiveness during a late-season blizzard that struck in early April. Despite temperatures dropping to 15 below zero with driving snow that lasted 4 days, Carl maintained the core living space at 60 degrees Fahrenheit while consuming only 3/4 of a cord of wood. The thermal mass system meant that morning temperatures in the heated area dropped no lower than 50 degrees, eliminating the shock of waking to near freezing conditions that plagued conventional cabin layouts. Jensen, still relying on standard heating methods in his unmodified cabin, burned through 1 1/2 cords during the same storm period while struggling to maintain interior temperatures above 40 degrees. The difference highlighted the compounding effects of Carl's systematic approach. Efficient walls prevented heat loss, reduced volume decreased energy requirements, and thermal mass extended heating periods without additional fuel input. By the spring of 1840, after 2 full winters of newspaper insulation success, Carl discovered that his thermal efficiency gains had created an unexpected problem. The cabin's improved airtightness, combined with cooking moisture, breath condensation, and occasional snow melt, had begun trapping humidity inside the living space with no natural escape route. During a warm spell in April, when exterior temperatures climbed above freezing for several consecutive days, Carl noticed dark spots appearing along the bottom edges of his newspaper layers where they met the log walls. Peeling back, a corner section revealed the source of concern. Moisture had condensed between the innermost newspaper layer and the log surface, creating conditions perfect for mold growth and gradual decomposition of both the paper adhesive and the wood itself. The paste that had performed so well during dry winter conditions turned mushy when exposed to persistent dampness, allowing the paper to sag and separate from the wall surface. Left unchecked, this moisture retention threatened to undermine the entire insulation system while creating health hazards from mold spores and rotting organic materials. The problem stemmed from a fundamental oversight in Carl's original design. His newspaper barrier had solved heat loss through infiltration and conduction, but it had also eliminated the natural air exchange that prevented moisture accumulation in traditional log construction. Conventional mud chinking, despite its thermal inefficiency, allowed enough air movement to carry away excess humidity before it could condense on cold surfaces. Carl's successful air sealing had created an unintentionally airtight environment that trapped water vapor with no outlet. Carl recognized the need for controlled ventilation that could remove excess moisture without compromising thermal performance. He studied the cabin's air circulation patterns by releasing smoke from smoldering prairie grass in different locations and observing its movement throughout the interior space. The experiment revealed that natural convection currents rose from the heated core area toward the ceiling, then cooled and descended along the exterior walls where the newspaper insulation prevented their escape. Working with materials available from his woodworking supplies, Carl constructed simple ventilation ports using pine boards and leather hinges salvaged from worn-out harness equipment. He positioned intake vents near floor level on the south wall, where solar heating created the strongest pressure differential, and exhaust vents near the roof peak on the north side. Each vent measured 4 inches square and incorporated wooden slats that could be adjusted to control airflow volume while preventing direct infiltration of wind-driven precipitation. The ventilation system required precise calibration to achieve moisture control without excessive heat loss. Carl discovered that opening the vents fully during cold weather negated much of his thermal efficiency gains, while closing them completely during humid periods allowed dangerous moisture accumulation. Through trial and observation, he developed a seasonal adjustment protocol that opened vents to 1/4 capacity during winter months and half capacity during spring and fall transition periods when interior humidity levels peaked. Installation of the ventilation system revealed another critical oversight. The direct contact between newspaper and log surfaces created a vapor trap that prevented moisture from escaping even when overall air. Circulation improved. Carl needed a separation layer that would allow trapped moisture to evaporate and exit the wall cavity through the new ventilation system without compromising the insulation value of his newspaper layers. Burlap grain sacks, obtained from the grain elevator in town, provided the solution. Carl attached this coarse woven fabric directly to the log surfaces using wooden strips and small nails, creating a rough, textured backing that held the cloth approximately 1/4 inch away from the wood. The burlap's open weave allowed air movement behind the newspaper layers, while providing a mounting surface for his paste and paper application. This separation meant that any condensation forming on the cold log surface could evaporate into the airspace behind the newspaper and exit through the ventilation system. The fabric backing required modifications to Carl's proven application technique. He applied paste to the burlap surface rather than directly to the logs, which demanded a thicker mixture to penetrate the cloth weave and provide adequate adhesion for the newspaper layers. The burlap absorbed moisture from the paste more readily than smooth wood surfaces, requiring him to work in smaller sections to prevent premature drying of the adhesive before paper application. Eric Johansson, whose experience with European building techniques had proven valuable throughout Karl's experimentation process, confirmed that similar vapor management principles had guided construction in Sweden's timber regions. His grandfather's farmhouse had incorporated birch bark strips behind interior planking, specifically to create drainage paths for condensation while maintaining insulation value. The principle remained consistent across different materials and climates. Trapped moisture required controlled escape routes to prevent structural damage and health problems. The first test of the modified system came during an unusually wet spring when snow melt combined with frequent rain to create high humidity conditions that challenged every homestead's moisture management. Karl monitored the newspaper layers weekly, checking for signs of dampness, sagging, or mold formation. The burlap backing successfully prevented direct contact between condensation and paper, while the ventilation system carried away excess moisture before it could accumulate to dangerous levels. Maintenance emerged as a critical component of long-term system performance. Karl developed a seasonal inspection routine that examined the newspaper layers for damage from moisture, pests, or simple wear. Each spring, he replaced the bottom two layers of paper in areas where rising ground moisture created the greatest risk of deterioration. This maintenance required approximately 2 days of work annually, but prevented the complete system failure that would have necessitated starting over with full wall reapplication. The ventilation and vapor barrier modifications reduced Karl's fuel efficiency gains from 40% to 35% compared to conventional construction, but the compromise proved essential for system durability. During the autumn of 1840, when several neighbors attempted to copy his newspaper technique without understanding the moisture management requirements, Karl observed failures similar to those he had experienced before implementing his ventilation solutions. Their applications showed signs of mold, sagging, and adhesive failure within months, confirming that thermal efficiency alone was insufficient for a viable long-term building system. By winter's onset, Karl had integrated moisture control into his comprehensive approach that balanced thermal performance, structural durability, and occupant health. The system required more sophisticated understanding than simple newspaper application, but it provided sustainable performance that could withstand the variable conditions of prairie weather while maintaining the fuel savings that made the technique worthwhile for resource-conscious homesteaders. The winter of 1942 arrived with unprecedented ferocity across the Nebraska plains. The first blizzard struck in early December, dropping temperatures to 35 below zero and maintaining brutal conditions for 18 consecutive days. Supply roads became impassable, cutting off homesteads from town resources for nearly 3 weeks. Fuel deliveries ceased entirely, leaving families dependent on whatever wood they had managed to stockpile before the storm system settled over the region. Karl's comprehensive building system faced its ultimate test during this extended siege. His modified cabin, now incorporating 4 years of refinements including newspaper insulation, thermal mass, controlled ventilation, and vapor management, maintained interior temperatures that averaged 52 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the coldest period. His fuel consumption during those critical 18 days totaled 2 1/4 cords of split oak, carefully measured and recorded in his daily log. 300 yards away, the Jensen family struggled to survive in their conventionally built cabin using standard mud chinking and traditional heating methods. Despite burning 4 cords of wood during the same period, their interior temperatures never climbed above 40 degrees and dropped as low as 28 degrees during the worst nights. Mrs. Jensen reported that water froze in containers placed more than 6 feet from their stove, and ice formed on interior walls despite continuous firing. The Olson homestead, positioned on similar terrain with identical exposure to prevailing winds, consumed 5 1/2 cords of wood while maintaining interior temperatures that barely reached 35 degrees during peak heating periods. Olson's family moved their sleeping arrangements directly beside the stove for survival, abandoning most of their cabin's living space to conditions that threatened stored food supplies and posed genuine hypothermia risks. Documentation of these comparative results spread through the scattered homesteading community as supply roads reopened in early January. Carl's systematic approach had demonstrated measurable superiority under extreme conditions that exposed the fundamental weaknesses of conventional frontier building methods. His 35% reduction in fuel consumption, combined with significantly higher interior comfort levels, provided quantifiable evidence that challenged accepted wisdom about prairie construction. Eric Johansson became the first neighbor to request detailed instruction in Carl's methods. Working together through the spring of 1943, they modified Johansson's cabin using identical techniques: burlap backing, multiple newspaper layers, controlled ventilation, and thermal mass integration. Johansson documented his results during the following winter, recording interior temperatures that averaged 15 degrees higher than his previous year's performance while consuming approximately 40% less firewood. The adoption process revealed critical details about technique transfer and system integration. Johansson discovered that simply copying the newspaper application without understanding vapor management principles led to moisture problems that threatened the entire investment. Only after implementing Carl's complete approach, including seasonal ventilation adjustments and annual maintenance protocols, did he achieve results comparable to the original installation. Word of the documented successes reached other homesteading communities across the region through informal networks of visiting neighbors, supply store conversations, and letters exchanged between families scattered across the vast prairie distances. Several homesteaders from communities 50 miles away traveled specifically to examine Carl's cabin and interview him about construction details. These visits led to systematic adoption of newspaper insulation techniques across multiple counties, adapted to local material availability and specific climate challenges. The broader acceptance process illuminated resistance patterns that had initially hindered adoption. Homesteaders with successful traditional methods showed reluctance to invest time and effort in techniques that appeared crude or temporary. However, families facing fuel shortages, inadequate heating performance, or structural failures with conventional chinking demonstrated much greater willingness to experiment with alternative approaches. Economic pressure, rather than technical curiosity, drove most adoption decisions. By 1945, regional homesteading publications began including references to layered paper insulation among accepted winterization techniques. The Prairie Farmer's Almanac published a brief article describing newspaper wall treatments as frugal but effective methods for improving cabin thermal performance. This formal recognition marked a significant shift from the mockery and skepticism that had initially greeted Carl's experiments. During the post-war years, commercial insulation development began incorporating principles that validated Carl's intuitive discoveries. Cellulose insulation manufacturers processed recycled newspaper fiber into loose-fill products designed for blown-in installation between wall studs. The industrial process treated the paper with fire-retardant chemicals and chopped it into consistent fiber lengths, but the fundamental mechanism remained identical to Carl's layered approach: paper fiber trapping dead air to provide thermal resistance. Technical analysis of surviving homestead structures from this period confirmed the long-term effectiveness of newspaper insulation applications. Building inspectors examining properties during 1950s modernization projects found newspaper layers still intact and functional after more than a decade of service. In many cases, the improvised insulation had preserved structural wood better than conventional methods by eliminating the moisture infiltration that caused rot in traditionally chinked log construction. Manufacturing companies studying these field installations adopted the proven principles for commercial products. Owens Corning researchers analyzed the dead air trapping mechanisms that made layered paper effective and incorporated similar concepts into their emerging fiberglass insulation designs. Johns Manville developed cellulose products specifically based on recycled newspaper processing, acknowledging that frontier homesteaders had demonstrated the viability of paper-based thermal barriers decades before industrial applications. Modern building science textbooks reference these early experiments as foundational examples of empirical insulation development. The principles Carl discovered through necessity and observation anticipated industrial research by 20 years, demonstrating that careful attention to thermal behavior, moisture management, and material properties could yield significant performance improvements using readily available resources. Surviving members of the original homesteading community still recalled Carl's innovations when interviewed by regional historians during the 1970s. Their testimonies documented fuel savings, comfort improvements, and construction techniques that had enabled family survival during some of the harshest winters in recorded Nebraska history. These oral histories provided verification that systematic application of basic thermal principles could overcome the limitations of conventional building wisdom through methodical observation, experimentation, and refinement. Carl's approach demonstrated that effective building solutions emerge from understanding fundamental physical principles rather than simply following established practices, a lesson that remained relevant for subsequent generations facing resource constraints and environmental challenges.